And there's another line, a refrain that you hear repeated in Deuteronomy, which I've always returned to, I thought was so interesting, which is when God says, do not forget the Lord your God in your prosperity. It's not when we're down and out. It's when we're actually materially wealthy, when things are going well, when we're producing all of these things and our quality of life is really good, that God gets removed from the picture. This is part of the issue to me, forgetting God in our wealth, in our prosperity. We've progressed in such a way that we think we don't need God, but that's obviously not the case.
It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Welcome back to the AC Podcast. My name is Andy Steiger. I'm joined today with Steve Kim and Ben McDonald. Welcome to the show, boys.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be back.
It is good to be with you guys. We should probably let our listeners know that Wes isn't going to be with us for a little bit, as he and his wife, Melissa, have just welcomed their fourth child into the world. Yay. Luke James Huff. Congratulations to you guys. We're excited for the Huff family. It keeps growing, as do all your duties as parents. A lot of diaper changing going on there, but so thankful for you guys. Also thankful that you actually had this the child semi-normally without any sort of drama. Last child was born in a car on the way to the hospital. So,
I didn't even know that.
We told Wes, hey, listen, if your wife tells you that she's in labor, take her seriously and be prepared to go to the hospital immediately.
That sounds like Wes, too, just going, it's fine, you'll be fine.
Guys, we're going to jump into a conversation today that is something I've thought a lot about. I know that you guys have as well, especially anybody living in North America. But you know what? It's not just a North American thing. It is more and more a global thing. It's the problem of progress. The problem of progress. And I don't know about you guys, but this is an issue that I constantly find myself grappling with, is this idea bigger, faster, better, and that ultimately life is about progress.
Yeah. And that, especially given our recent sort of, not maybe obsession, but our preoccupation with technology too, works into that as well. This kind of scientific, technological mindset can easily come into this.
Well, I mean, do you have the latest iPhone? Do you have the latest update? Do you have the latest? I mean, it continues over. Like it goes on and on. And now I know there's lots of different places that we could take this conversation, but I'm curious how this conversation has affected you guys personally. If we could just even begin there, because I find that this is an issue that I have wrestled with a long time, especially as I've struggled with regards to the question of like the meaning of life. Like, why am I here? What is this all about? What does Christianity have to say to the purpose of our lives? And ultimately, is it about progress, or is it about something more than that? And so let's just get into that, but let's just be honest with ourselves that although we have the Christian answer that I want to get into, I think if we're honest with ourselves, this problem of progress, you will find yourself over and over again coming back to this and needing to remind yourself again, no. I got to pull myself out of this trap of progress. But how have you guys wrestled with this? And ultimately, let's get into what is the Christian worldview? How does the Christian worldview frame this?
Well, I think Steve and I started this conversation sort of talking about this idea of enchantment or disenchantment, this idea that we've sort of landed in the modern age where we are now in a way of thinking about our world that can sometimes be rather cold or static, just not imbued with life and all of the kinds of supernatural qualities that we as Christians believe it actually comes in part with. And so, the way in which we're trained to think within a society, whether we like it or not, we're informed by the culture that we're embedded in. And so often these things of technological progress or our capitalist, hyper-capitalist society that looks to consumerism and progression of goods and manufacturing new and new desires for things, this can really embed itself into our way of thinking. And as a result, too, we're post-scientific revolution. This has been a triumph of the scientific revolution in many ways, is that we have a lot of things now. We live a life of luxury. And that's really good in many ways, but I do worry about the spiritual dearth that may have created. And when you read the Bible, when you're in Scripture, you're invited back into this world of enchantment where there's the supernatural is doing things. And I think that's where we have to bridge this gap. We have to somehow bring these worlds together and caution our way of thinking to say, well, how is it that we view everything in the world? What's our imagination supplying us with?
Yeah. And I think it's a matter of the kind of progress that we're talking about, right? So progress as an aspect of our lives, or is it this kind of overarching frame that we view the whole life with? Right. So for example, I mean, you guys and me, we've done some post-secondary education, right? So we would like to think that we've made progress in our academic career. At the same time, that's an aspect of our lives. That's an academic aspect of our lives. But what happens when you take this thing called progress, and that is the overarching frame, the meaning of human existence, right? And I think that's where the danger is. I think that can easily slip into that kind of disenchantment.
Well, let's just tease that out then. Let's juxtapose this between culture and the Bible. What would culture say is progress, and what would ultimately be a biblical view of progress?
It seems to me like progress in society, we use words like success. It's often associated largely with monetary gain, with being financially secure, with somehow having a status symbol. Now, I know that I don't want to blanket all of culture and say that, well, that's just the way that it's defined. But I think the truth is that as you move further into a process of secularization, when you get rid of the transcendental, when you get rid of God and religious qualities that give life meaning and imbue it with meaning in the everyday, you are forced in many ways to view things by their attributes. You have to start to look at the qualities of something rather than the thing itself in order to appreciate it. And as a result, progress in society looks like achieving more and more, looks like climbing a social ladder, separating yourself from the crowd. They're all down here, but I've achieved these things that no one else has. Whereas I think when we enter into the Bible, we are told that success and progress, if we are going to even use those terms, looks like putting myself beneath, looks like treating others as better than myself, looks like serving in any way that I possibly can for the betterment of humanity.
So, Ben, when you talk about the secular and the transcendental, are you talking about basically a life lived without God? Is that kind of how you're defining those?
I would actually say it doesn't necessarily have to be so. And I should let our viewers know that I'm using a lot of the language that has been given to us by the philosopher Charles Taylor. He wrote a book called A Secular Age back in 2007. And for most people, it's been kind of the benchmark text for talking about secularity, defining it, and thinking about the way in which our modern language works in our cultural ethos, so to speak. Secularization, in the way that Taylor is defining it, is something that it's not a subtraction narrative. This is his big thing. The secular is not what you get just when you strip away all of religious trappings or language. What he's really saying is, through a bunch of historical cultural shifts in time, what's happened is that society thinks of itself more and more within an immanent frame. It thinks of itself as being materialist. There is no great beyond. And religion can be brought into the equation, but it becomes more and more of an option. Whereas 500 years ago, it simply wasn't. You had a religious worldview. God was sort of an obvious thing. But nowadays, people feel like they can choose in much the same way that our consumer culture wants to work. We feel like we can choose to be religious or not. We can participate or not. We're sort of shopping for our church or shopping for our religion. Well, that's a new phenomenon, and it plays into our newfound autonomy and individualism. And in many ways, that is the thing that's driving everything forward and giving us a worldview that the Bible, I think, wants to correct.
Yeah, the whole religion becoming an option thing, it's almost as though we look at religion like a fantasy hockey team that you just pick a team and you cheer for it, right?
Yeah.
But a religion as a take on reality isn't like that. It's an all-encompassing sort of thing. It can't just remain an option.
So, as an all-encompassing aspect of our lives, Steve, what would you say then is or should be kind of a biblical view then of progress, and how would that look different?
Yeah, I think of progress. I mean, I think in biblical terms, you could talk about progress, right? When a sinner repents and turns his back on his sins and turns himself back towards God in Christ Jesus, I would call that a genuine progress, right? When the world has fallen apart because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, when God, through Christ, restores all things, I would call that a progress. But this isn't the sort of progress that we're thinking of where everything rests on just what's broken in this world and how we fix it. It's more about who God is and how we rest in him, right? How we find that peace and contentment in him in such a way that we look at the world and go, okay, there's something broken in this world. We should do something about it and walk in step with what God is doing. So I think that's what I think of when I think of progress in biblical terms.
Now,
can I add to that?
yeah.
Do you mind if I just want to add to that, because I think what I think is, from a biblical standpoint, the verse that's really coming to my mind is when Jesus on the cross says, "It is finished." And when you kind of imagine, well, what does he mean by that? What's finished?
Good point.
We can look at it purely in terms of the salvific work that Christ is accomplishing on the cross, but in a sense, I want to say it's bigger than that. When Jesus says it's finished, I think he means that in a macro sense. I think in some way we are operating in a world where everything that can be done, in a sense, is already completed. The question is, do you want to participate in that or not? The kingdom is here. Are you on board, so to speak? And so I totally agree with Steve. There's a genuine sense of progress, if we want to talk about it in the sense of, I'm better than I was yesterday. I turned to God more than I turned to my sin. That's real, genuine progress. I don't want to take away anything from that. But the truth is, and this was a prayer, I think, that once Mother Teresa prayed, where she said, you can build something over 100 years that somebody could destroy in a day. Build anyway. And the reason why is because it's good in and of itself to simply build. You're not adding to the glory of God by anything you do as a human. You're also not subtracting from the glory of God by anything you do as a human. The point is to carve out a space where you can worship him and enjoy him freely and live in obedience to him. And that's the fullness of life. But it doesn't mean you have to somehow achieve this insane amount of things that the world constantly puts this internal pressure on us to achieve. We are able to love the creation the way that it is and to continue to work in it and to progress in the way that we've said, without ever thinking that, well, we're the final stand, and if we don't make it happen, then it's all for naught. And I think sometimes when you get rid of the religious sphere, again, this is exactly what happens in culture, is that they start to place those expectations on government and policy, and we suddenly think that our national leaders are going to be the ones that are going to save us and bring us to some utopia. But the biblical worldview is radically different than that. It's saying, Jesus from the cross, it is finished, so live in that reality now.
There's a lot that we could talk about there. I think the first thing that would be good for us to kind of hone in on that is an issue that people deal with on a day-to-day basis is really the identity piece to what you're getting at and what you're talking about,
Mm.
because as you talk about with Mother Teresa, and she says we'll build anyway. The idea there is that we build not because we're trying to find ourselves, but because we're already found. There's a big difference between seeking after progress with your identity rooted in Jesus versus seeking after progress in an attempt to actually find yourself. And this is the trap of progress that I find myself often, circling back in, is why am I writing another book? Why am I on a podcast with Apologetics Canada? Why are we building? Or what is it that I'm with getting another degree, or getting that car or that house or having that child? I just think about the different things in your life and ask yourself, why do I do those things? Why am I seeking after those things that I seek after? And do I do that in an attempt to find myself, to build some sort of identity of who I am? Or I would argue from a Christian perspective, and what you were getting at, Ben, it is finished. I am founded in Jesus. My identity is rooted in him. And these sorts of things I'm not doing to try to define myself or find myself, but because I'm in fact found. And when you come at things from that different perspective, man, does it change your life, because now you're not in a constant identity crisis.
Yeah. And there is a huge difference between those two options, even though the external things may remain the same, right? You can have two people who undergo the exact same scenarios who have vastly different responses to things. So what you're talking about, Andy, this idea of somebody who is always trying to achieve, write the next book, get married, have children, those kinds of things. If that is rooted in, okay, this is a matter of self-creation. This is me trying to create my identity, build my identity through these things. Then you're going to have this up and down roller coaster all the time, of where you reach this mountain peak, but then you can't stay there, right? You have to come down, and then you look for the next mountain peak. And I have no idea why we picked those specific mountain peaks, called education and marriage and having children, buying a house, those kinds of things. I don't know why we picked those ones, but we do anyway, because that's what everybody else is doing. So you pick that, you go up there, you come down, you go up there. So that's what you're talking about, right? The identity crisis of always reaching the peak and then coming down, reaching the peak and coming down. Whereas you can do those exact same things. You can go get a degree, you can get married, have children, buy a house, buy a car, all the while knowing, hey, these are good things. My identity doesn't depend on it. I'm going to sort of operate, if that's not too crass of a word, from the place of victory in my identity, rooted in somebody who does not change, in Jesus Christ, right? Rather than this constantly shifting quicksand of up and down identity crisis.
It just reminded me, it's the myth of Sisyphus, right? That's exactly what it is. You're left to just roll the boulder up the hill, and then it's going to come right back down. And once you achieve the next level, there's going to be the next level. And there's always going to be somebody beyond you, And I think that we're encouraged to reorient ourselves to a way of thinking where we can actually just pour ourselves into the thing because it's good, true, and beautiful in itself to do that. And as a result, we receive meaning and purpose in that, and we don't have to search for that validation externally. I'm just reminded, because you have G.K. Chesterton on your wall right behind you there, Steve, and we were
Yeah.
we were talking about him earlier this week, and this idea of enchantment, disenchantment, and sort of romanticizing the world that we live in, romanticizing the ordinary things. And I revisited his book Orthodoxy, and he had a great quote in there about the fact that Rome is not loved because it was great because it was loved. And it's this idea of, that's the gospel in a sense. The fact that I am loved by Jesus, not because I'm great, but I'm great because I am loved by him. And when we orient our world that way and think about it first as this gift that's been given to us and can appreciate all of these things, well, then we can pour meaning into everything. We can pour meaning into all kinds of things because our identities aren't founded on them. We don't need to progress to some point to to achieve some level where, oh, now I've satisfied everybody and they accept me for who I am. No, it's the other way around.
So within that frame of thinking, then, Ben, what would you say is a successful Christian? What does success look like for a Christian?
Well, I think we can fall into a trap really easily of thinking that then it's just the same paradigm of progress we have shifted over to piety. And sometimes this happens in the Christian world. We borrow sort of the cultural epistemology of thinking about the world and how we succeed, and then we bring it into our faith. And so we think that success as a Christian means, well, I go to church every Sunday and I pray 3 times a day and I do these things. And don't get me wrong, those are all good things, and it might help you become a successful Christian in one sense. But really, the more I think about this, the more I think that it has to do with this idea of carving out a space where I can be in worship with God, that there is no external thing that must be achieved. It's simply a place of obedience. One of the things that frees us from this thing of identity that Christians talk about is our calling. We are called to do certain things. It's not just up to us to say, well, I have a free range of choice and I can go after everything. And of course, the Bible says you are free to do anything you want. But that comes also with the sense of saying, what is the Holy Spirit asking you to do, asking you to contribute? And I think perfect freedom really comes when you are so in line with the Spirit that way, and you have a fidelity with the Father that you feel like you're meant to be where you are. And when you in faith can live in a spot where you go, I believe God's called me to this place, and I can rest in that. That's a piece that most people, I don't think, really know until they come to faith.
Wes Huff here. I am at the ancient archaeological site of the city of Ephesus here in Turkey, and I want to encourage you to come to the Can I Trust the Bible lecture series happening at Grace Toronto Church on November 7th, Friday, November 7th. Come listen to myself, Dr. Gretchen Hazinga, and a conversation moderated by Pastor Dan McDonald. It's going to be really exciting. Make sure to go to apologeticscanada.com to find out how to register.
This is one of the reasons why when I'm asked by young people in particular, that age-old question of what should I do with my life, and they're looking for direction, I often will say 3 things. One is, I'll ask them, where's your relationship with the Lord at? Do you have a good, healthy relationship with the Lord? And then secondly, asking, what are the desires of your heart? Because I believe firmly that your desires will be God's desires when you're in a right relationship with God. And then I believe that you and I have to be attentive to, and this is the third one, at the doors or the opportunities that God opens in our life, because we need to believe or hold true that if God can know you better than you know yourself, then you should always be open to the Spirit's leading in your life, because it means that God can lead you someplace better than you can lead yourself. But within that framework, though, of everything that we've been talking about, here's where I would say is success as a Christian, and really just boiling it down to Jesus' greatest commandment: love God, love people. Now, the way you kind of put that, Ben, was to worship God, I think is the words you used. And I guess I would frame that within the context of relationship. Within the context of relationship with God, that you and I praise and worship God, that's an aspect of that relationship that we have with God. That we are in this relationship. And really then, what we're saying is that the journey of life, or the progress of life, actually the thing that's of most value is actually the relationships, the relationship we have with God and the relationships we have with one another. And all those other things aren't bad per se, but those aren't the defining features of what life is all about.
Mm-hmm. I mean, at the end of the day, what grounds this whole thing, right? Because what you're saying is what grounds this whole thing, biblically speaking, is that relationship. Love God, love people, hence our slogan as an organization. But if what frames this whole thing is just merely achievement, then it's going to be that quicksand, right? And I think that's where this sort of disenchantment can come in, because within that idea of this progress, as we sort of culturally understand it, I think there is an element of pride. There is an element of taking certain things for granted, right? I ought to achieve more. There's a certain expectation that I'm almost entitled to go to the next thing, to achieve the next thing.
I don't know that I
Right.
would use the word entitled. I feel like I would use the word pressured, or
Sure.
I don't know what would there's this cultural, I guess, pressure, this cultural pressure push that you are not enough. And if you want to prove that you're enough, well, you do that by how much you achieve.
Well, and Andy, I think the issue too, and maybe the reason why why the language needs to be adjusted, is because so much of that happens without our knowing it. It sort of seeps in. It's not like that pressure feels like pressure all the time. It's sort of surreptitious. It's sneaking its way in and filtering through our minds, whether we like it or not. It's almost acting at the subconscious level. And so this is the thing that we're here to protect against. And why I think when we talk about the problem of progress, one of the main problems is that we from birth are sort of situated in that cultural ethos to think through those terms. We're handed this world. Is why I mentioned hyper-capitalism, for instance. The economic structures that we have in place, the boundary between those and our sociological makeup is almost superficial. We tend to just think of them as economic systems. They're not. They inform our entire ways of thinking. They supply a cultural imagination that makes us desire things beyond what's necessary, that make us consume, that make us think of progress in this term. Right now I'm speaking to you on an iPhone that is an update from last year that was wholly unnecessary to the betterment of my life. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter for consumerist culture. Well, take that and then map it onto human beings and human nature. Suddenly everything becomes a plethora of choice, and it's up to me. Suddenly there's a burden of responsibility. I have to choose what it is that makes me successful. I have to accessorize my very way of being. This is the kind of stuff that we, I think, unwittingly imbibe and take into our thinking. And this is where fidelity to the Christian faith, to reading scripture, to understanding what is it that Jesus is saying. And Jesus told you not to worry about the clothes you're going to wear or the food you're going to eat, right? That sounds entirely anti-pragmatic. Like, how am I supposed to plan for the future? And Jesus is going, let tomorrow worry about tomorrow. I mean, that's radical thinking. And more is that a needed message for us today.
And a couple of things to pick up on there. The first is, I think two things are true at the same time, right? Yes, there is that cultural pressure. And like you were saying, Ben, there is that sort of pressure doesn't always feel like pressure, right? It informs our expectations as well. And so living in that constant pressure of bigger, better, faster, whatever, newer, right? The next iPhone, the next MacBook, the next whatever other product that you use, that creates that frame of expectation, which then you take to be the natural, normal thing. And then you form this sense of entitlement. So I think both things are true at once. Having said that, there is a certain underlying all of that. I mean, you mentioned hypercapitalism. I mean, advertising, in a sense, that's what advertisers count on, is that sense of discontentment with what you have, right? And that's how they drive you to buy the next thing, bigger thing, fancier thing, flashier thing. And that kind of sense of discontentment, I would argue, is at least partially rooted in taking some things for granted. And I think G.K. Chesterton really kind of pushed back on how even the most ordinary things are extraordinary. It's amazing. It's marvelous. This world isn't just full of wonders. This world itself is a wonder, right? So that enchantment of the ordinary.
Let me add to this very quickly, because I don't want our viewers to somehow be listening to what I'm saying and like, who's that Marxist you got on the podcast? But before, just so they understand, I mean, I'm not saying that capitalism as an economic structure is bad all the way down. I'm not trying to beat up on it that way. What I'm trying to say is the way in which that structure maneuvers itself into our ways of thinking about the world. I mean, it's important to note Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, who created the form of capitalism that we sort of enjoy today, he had also written an anthropology as well on the sentiment of morals that went along with that work that is largely forgotten. And his point was, human beings have to be defined in such a way and understand their place in the world and their relationship to God in such a way that they know how to handle these kinds of systems, because left to their own devices, we can unravel. And it strikes me as well, just pertaining to this conversation, how interesting it is that, the final commandment of the 10 Commandments is not to envy, and not to look to others and to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. And there's another line, a refrain that you hear repeated in Deuteronomy, which I've always returned to, I thought was so interesting, which is when God says, "Do not forget the Lord your God in your prosperity." It's not when we're down and out. It's when we're actually materially wealthy, when things are going well, when we're producing all of these things and our quality of life is really good, that God gets removed from the picture. And there are so many people I talk to, when I talk to a lot of atheists, as an apologist or just as a human being in general life here, and I have these conversations, it's interesting to me how many people talk about, well, I have no need for God. I have no utility for that. Why would I bring God into the conversation? And that just strikes me as, well, you should be so lucky to think that you don't need God, right? Your God forgetfulness comes from this comfort of living that you've been handed to by, going back to the word progress, by the progress that Christianity has helped supply the West with. And so anyway, there's a lot there. It's very intertwined, but this is part of the issue to me, forgetting God in our wealth, in our prosperity. We've progressed in such a way that we think we don't need God, but that's obviously not the case.
That's an interesting point. If we see this from a Christian perspective, that true progress is to be in relationship with God, is to love God, and is to love people, that this is good. Which, by the way, if we just look at that from a foundational perspective, we're talking about morality, that your moral character is actually the foundation of your life. Now, that I think that's going to strike some people's ears as moralism, and I'm not talking about moralism unless I'm talking about Jesus Christ's righteousness that has been imputed to me. Then sure, we could talk about moralism from that perspective. As a Christian, my foundation is in fact the righteousness of Jesus Christ. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that, and I've said this before, notice how people can be very successful in this world with regards to progress and achieve all sorts of things only to have it come crumbling down because of their moral character. That at the end of the day, people don't care if we use, history's whipping boy, Hitler. They don't care that he was wealthy, popular, famous, authored books, and held high political office. His moral character outshadowed any of his progress, any of his accomplishments. And that's true of everybody, not just him. So clearly our character matters. And from a Christian perspective, we believe it significantly matters because it separates you from God. But that through Christ, our relationship with God can be reconciled, and that we can truly progress in our love for God and our love for one another. Now, that was just a bit of of me just kind of preaching there. But I wanted to get back to what you were talking about there, Ben, with regards to culture. Now, I think a lot of people might hear this conversation, as you were already kind of hedging there, that hear this conversation and might think that we're against progress, that right. Progress is bad or something to that effect. But I think you would agree, we're not saying that at all. There's nothing wrong with the newest iPhone. There's nothing wrong with, building things. In fact, I would actually argue that we've been given that mandate in Genesis to cultivate the garden, right? And there is this progress that goes from the garden to the city. I mean, John Dyer's book I think is aptly named, From the Garden to the City, that there is this progress, that we weren't meant to just stay in the garden,
Yeah.
that this cultivates into a city, that there's nothing wrong necessarily with a city.
I think that's entirely correct. I want to be somebody who cares about pouring myself into the things of God. God is a creator. That's the first thing I know about God. I'm meant to be creative and to work and to pour myself into these projects that hopefully do grow. And I think we're absolutely called to do that. I think what we're talking about is tying your worth to it in any sort of way. But absolutely, I think, you know, in a way I could say, when I look culturally at the things around, there's a reason why I can appreciate Rolex and Ferrari and sort of detest Walmart. You know what I mean? One of these is mass produced and is just, and I maybe I'm getting too deep into the weeds here and I don't want to offend anyone, but what I'm trying to say is there's something to be said for quality and craftsmanship and caring about something, not as a status symbol, but because it's good in of itself. And then there's something else about just proliferating and manufacturing and making something stale and cold that we just, you know, we continue to produce and pop out because, well, it keeps money flowing and things like that. And I just think our values are meant to be different. We're supposed to turn to something else.
Which, by the way, I got to tell you guys, doing my doctoral work and being in the UK as much as I have, with regards to in Scotland, well, that was one of the things that hit me, probably the first, with my time in the UK and in Europe in general. Now, this isn't, I don't want to make this kind of statement that this is the case for across the board in Europe, but I would argue, by and large, from what I've seen, it's a big difference from what I see here in North America versus what I often see in Europe. That we imbibe much more of the Home Depot kind of view of life here, that you've got to update the floors, you've got to update the walls, you got to update, right? Because we can get caught up in this. And really, to go to what you guys were saying, even just the advertising that can tell you and make you believe that you need this, you know, that you've got to continue to seek after this progress. Whereas often when I see in Europe is just people have homes that are hundreds of years old and they're quite okay with that. Mm-hmm. And you'll go to lots of homes that haven't been updated in a very long time. But there's an interesting sense of just kind of peace to that at the same time. And again, I'm not saying that to say that there's anything wrong with your Home Depot per se, but man, do we have to be careful that we don't get caught back up in that trick of, you know, that trap of progress where we think bigger, better, newer, you know, and constantly doing that and not realizing that our identity is getting caught up in it. And if we're honest with ourselves, that we could actually see that we need to just pause and ask myself, okay, why am I building that? Or why am I buying that? And asking those bigger questions of identity.
Whenever we talk about progress, I think it always comes back to the tension you're referring to, Andy, is this idea of, well, you want progress on the one hand, but that's also not all there is to it. There is a time and place for you slowing down and appreciating what you have rather than always moving on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I think that tension is wherever you find this discussion of progress, that's what you will find. I'm reading and studying a lot of literature on contentment and discontentment because that's what my PhD studies kind of involve. And every article that I read, that's exactly what's there. You know, on the one hand, yes, you want progress, you want discontentment to improve things. On the other hand, if that's all you do, then you're not going to be able to enjoy life, or you're going to have. So what I often see people talk about is this idea that contentment as a virtue, or, you know, just appreciating the world that that's around you, the goodness of the world that is around you, even though the world is imperfect, is that it is a corrective thing. Right? You want to hold those two things at the same time. It's not just that progress is all bad, and just appreciating things all the time is good. I mean, yes, you want to appreciate things, but you also have to be realistic. The world is broken, and in fact, that is one very good reason for you to be a progressive, whether politically or culturally, whatever. You have to accept the fact that the world is broken. Otherwise, what is it that you're trying to improve, right? And so, yeah, I think there is that tension there. You always have to hold the two. And I would even argue that you have to, as Chesterton called it, you have to hold those two furious opposites together and not try to just compromise one over the other. But you have to, I mean, this is a bit of an odd illustration that Chesterton used. He said, you have to storm this world like it's an ogre's castle, and yet this has to be your cottage that you come home to at night. So you have to hold those two things, these furious opposites, together. And so the idea is, can you hate the world enough to change it, and yet love the world enough to find it worth changing? So that's the tension that we're always working with.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Let me ask you guys a question. If you're just to be honest with your own struggles with progress, where have you guys personally wrestled with the identity versus the progress? And I as an example for myself, doing a PhD was like a year-long battle with myself of whether or not I should do that or not, if it was the right choice to make. Even buying a house was a big question for myself. I know that might sound odd, but thinking through those kind of big decisions or purchases of life, what have been some of those for you guys?
Very, very similar to you, Andy. I mean, doing a PhD was a big challenge. And I remember having this conversation with my wife when I went to go do PhD studies at the University of Toronto. I remember thinking, okay, this means a real commitment to, a bit of a life of poverty for the next little while. You're going to make some sacrifices. But more than that, I knew specifically that we were moving from, I was living in the Valley. I was going to Acadia Divinity College doing my master's, and I knew that I was going to Toronto. And I said to my wife, it's going to be extra hard living there because in Toronto, you are surrounded by opulent wealth and you're not going to have it. And all of a sudden, you're suddenly inundated by all of these people, quote unquote, getting ahead, moving on with their lives, driving the Aston Martin, living in the financial district or whatever it is, working in the financial district and living in these mansions. And you're this poor student trying to do what you think is best, trying to follow your passion, trying to do what you think you're called to. And that for me was a major spiritual battle, a temptation to sort of flee everything and run. Oh, just go get a sales job and get out of this. And no, I'm called to something else, and I have to struggle in that, and I have to be in this world and not of this world, and I have to lay it down and somehow struggle through and realize that this is what God has called me to. That was not easy at all, and I am somebody who I think is very aware of that cultural pressure. It's in a lot of the work that I read and a lot of the people who I study, but this idea that is not a force that is easily shakable. And to pretend like I can rise above it really, it won't be a problem, is to be a little naive. I think that requires real ascetic discipline to stick to your faith, what you remind yourself of what it is that you're doing, what really counts. And that was the only way that I think I got through it. That and being in a community of people who supported that kind of work. Because when you're in community, I think that's another big part of this. When you have those friendships and family around you who can support you, you start to see those are the things that matter. And that helped push me through and made me get to the other side.
In my case, I mean, yeah, doing a PhD is a big step, and it's a long process, and it's such an emotional roller coaster. I mean, it's a big part of anybody's life journey if you are fortunate enough to do a PhD. But since you guys already mentioned that, I'll mention another area where I often struggle, and it's with respect to me being a parent with my children, right? And I look at my children, and my temptation, especially given my Asian background, uh, I mean, if you meet Asian parents, you will see how much they like to humble brag about their children, right? So I kind of, I grew up
Good.
around that a lot. Where, I mean, you go to Seoul, for example, in South Korea, there's something of a running joke that, there, whenever parents get together, it's this sort of constant back and forth about comparing their kids and who's better, kind of thing. So my temptation is to look at where my children are at, right? I have a daughter who's 11 years old. I have a son who's 9 years old. And I look at them, and there are certain things that I want them to be able to do. Whether it is, getting them to learn the language Korean, because that is part of their heritage, or whether it is them learning Taekwondo, because, somebody has to live the stereotype, or whatever it might be. Academic excellence, or, the excellence in social skills, or whatever it might be. But my temptation is to then always take them and turn them into objects of my desire. Right? I want to come off as good parents to other people, in the eyes of other people, and they are merely means to that end. That is a very real temptation. So what I have to constantly remind myself is, it's not up to me. I mean, they are my children, but in a sense, they're not. They're God's children. And he is the primary. He is the heavenly Father. I am merely entrusted with that task of, for the next 18 years, and I mean, not that I cease to be a parent once they turn 18, but those are critical years, right? Until they turn 18 or 19, whatever they reach the age of majority, they're in my care. So I always have to think to myself, in the words of St. John, right? I must decrease and he must increase. God has to increase and I must decrease. And that's true of parenting as well. So that is a struggle.
Steve, you given me this image of now your parents getting together with their friends and going like, my son's a doctor of theology. Do they have to sigh and go, oh, he is a doctor of theology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what's interesting about that, Steve? And maybe this is a good place for us to wrap up here. Is we'll often say, that, or you'll hear like in the, I believe it's the Westminster Catechism, that the chief aim of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever, and that there's actually something right about bragging about your kids and wanting to glory in your kids, but the problem is that we turn it inwards. And our kids actually are all about us. We want them to be about us. Where when we're talking about God, there's something quite beautiful that takes place where we're told right from Scripture that He first loved us, that God loves us. And in His love for us, His desire is that we would love Him, and that we, in fact, glorify God when we're in right relationship with God. I mean, that's one of the coolest things about being a parent, is you can have these moments that your kids do and can bring glory, if you want to use it in those terms. But it happens when you're in right relationship with your kids, when they do something, out of that moral character that we were talking about earlier, right? The kind of character that's being formed by God as they are living that out, and that reflects, like, if we want to put it in terms of ourselves, that when I love people, right, that it reflects back on God. It reflects back on who God is. And when my kids do something good or right, it makes me look good. But it's again, it's not that that's a bad thing, but is it done for the right reasons has been really undergirding this entire conversation. Before I end, I feel like maybe you wanted to say something before I end here.
I certainly do, because I'm so glad you brought up the Westminster Catechism is exactly what the language I was borrowing from earlier when I'm talking about Christian progress, carving out a space where we can glorify God and enjoy him eternally. That at the end, that is really the thing. And when the church, I mean, sometimes I hear Christians talk this way. I have a lot of students actually who I've heard talk this way, where we can confuse, I think, our priorities when we get caught up in this way of thinking about progress. That I've had students in the past say, well, the whole purpose is to evangelize. The whole purpose is to get out there and to preach the gospel and do the Great Commission. And that's our mission in the world. And I go, that's all well and good, but that is not the first priority. The first priority is to worship God. When God called the people out of Egypt initially, when the first time the word that eventually becomes church and assembly is used, the kahal in Hebrew, he calls them out of Egypt so that they may worship him. And if we don't worship, we wither. If we don't worship, then evangelism can't actually happen. And so it's not to say evangelism certainly is our mission in the world. Of course we want to go out and do that. Why are we doing this podcast? Why are we apologists? Of course we want to spread the gospel. But it begins with my glorifying God and enjoying him. And if I can't do that, and it's the same thing, you brought in our children, and it's the perfect analogy for this. I look at my child, I don't love my child because of their achievements, right? I love them so that they might achieve. And in the same way, if I don't love God with all of my heart, if I don't love God and love people, then anything that I do to contribute to the kingdom, so to speak, is worthless. And it doesn't mean anything. I can't progress beyond what God has already done. He's the one who always moves first.
And I think really what you're saying there, Ben, is because ultimately it becomes worthless because it's all about you. You're just turning inwards instead of it being all about God, instead of it being your life lived again for other people. Once again, that brings glory to God because it reflects the nature of who God is. That as we celebrate that God loved us so much that he was willing to humble himself and come in the person of Christ and be willing to serve and not be served, and ultimately serve with his life, and that he died for us. And I hope that this conversation's making sense for listeners, because the Christian worldview really is the upside down kingdom, as it's often called. Yeah. That it views things, often not differently than the way culture sees it, in the sense that we've talked about things very similar, that from a cultural perspective, that we can see things like progress being good, but we come at it from a very different perspective, which is often upside down from the way that the culture is perceiving it or is seeking after it. Kind of like, I like how you said that, Ben, with regards to your daughter. You love your daughter not because she's achieving, but you love her, and from that you see your desire is that she would achieve. And that's that Christian twist of the way that we see the world, and ultimately the way that motivates how we live in the world. Hope that this conversation has brought some clarity for you on your own progress and perhaps the decisions that you're seeking to make in your own life and how you live day to day. The AC Podcast has been Ministry of Apologetics Canada. We will come back next week with more things to think about. Until then, you know the drill. Love God, love people. Bye for now.
It's the AC Podcast.